Mom said, "It's not your place," at the will reading. Then the lawyer handed me The House I'm Elena, 37. And this is the story of how my grandmother's final gift taught me that blood doesn't always determine family. And sometimes the people who see your worth most clearly are the ones you least expect. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. The law office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat in the back corner of the conference room, my hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. Around the polished mahogany table, my family had arranged themselves, like pieces on a chessboard, each claiming their territory, with the confidence of people who believed they belonged there. My mother, Patricia, had chosen the seat directly across from the lawyer's chair, her posture rigid and commanding. She wore her grief-like armor, perfectly pressed and socially acceptable. My Uncle David flanked her right side, his wife Margaret beside him, both of them wearing expressions that suggested they were attending a business meeting, rather than the reading of their mother's will. My cousins filled in the remaining seats, their phones barely concealed beneath the table as they scrolled through social media with barely masked boredom. And then there was me, relegated to the folding chair they'd brought in as an afterthought, positioned so far from the table, I might as well have been sitting in the hallway. The message was clear. I was here out of obligation, not belonging. This wasn't new. For 37 years, I'd been the family's afterthought, the one who didn't quite fit the mold they'd cast for acceptable family members. While my cousins pursued careers in finance and law, following the prescribed path of success that my grandmother's generation had worked so hard to establish, I'd chosen teaching. While they married within their social circle and produced grandchildren on schedule, I'd remained single, focusing on my students and my small apartment across town. My crime, it seemed, was caring too much about the wrong things and not enough about the right ones. I taught third grade at a Title I school, spending my own money on classroom supplies and staying late to tutor kids whose parents worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. My family saw this as a waste of my education, a failure to maximize my potential. They'd stopped asking about my work years ago, their questions replaced by subtle suggestions about graduate school programs that might lead to more practical careers. But Grandma Rose had been different. She'd understood that some things couldn't be measured in salary figures or social status. She'd seen value in the thank you notes I'd bring home from parents, in the stories I'd share about breakthrough moments with struggling students when the rest of the family gathered for holidays and talked over me about stock portfolios and vacation homes. She'd pull me aside and ask about the kids in my classroom, remembering their names and their challenges with the kind of attention that made my chest tight with gratitude. The irony of sitting in this room now, surrounded by people who'd made it clear I didn't measure up to their standards, wasn't lost on me. These same relatives who'd spent years making me feel like an outsider at family gatherings were now forced to share space with me as we waited to hear how Grandma Rose had divided her worldly possessions. Part of me wondered why I'd even come. The lawyer's call had been brief and formal, requesting my presence at the will reading without explanation. My mother's reaction when I'd mentioned it had been telling. "I'm sure it's just a formality," she'd said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of dismissal. "Mother probably left you some small keepsake." You know how sentimental she could be about her charity cases. Charity cases. That's what I'd become in my own family's narrative. The relative they tolerated out of duty, the one who required their patience and occasional financial advice, though I'd never asked for either. They'd never understood that I didn't want their approval or their version of success. I'd simply wanted to belong, to feel like my presence added something valuable to the family dynamic, instead of being treated like a burden they'd inherited, along with the obligation to invite me to Christmas dinner. Sitting in that conference room, I felt the familiar weight of not being enough, not successful enough, not married enough, not ambitious enough to deserve a real seat at the table. The other chairs were leather and substantial, designed for people who mattered. Mine was metal and vinyl, borrowed from somewhere else, temporary and easily dismissed. I found myself studying the family photographs lining the office walls, images of other people's loved ones, frozen in moments of celebration and achievement. I wondered if those families had members like me, people who existed on the periphery, always questioning whether they truly belonged, or if they were simply being tolerated. The thought made my chest tighten. With the loneliness I'd carried for so long, it felt like part of my bone structure. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the appointed time, each second stretching longer than the last. My family continued. Their quiet conversations, discussions of estate taxes, and property values that they conducted as if I weren't there. Perhaps that was kindness, in their own way. Perhaps acknowledging my presence would have made this more awkward for everyone involved. But as I sat there, surrounded by people who shared my blood but not my values, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Grandma Rose had always been full of surprises, her mind sharp and her heart even sharper. She'd lived through 8 decades of joy and heartbreak, had buried a husband and raised 4 children, had built a life that extended far beyond the boundaries of social expectation. Whatever she'd decided about her legacy, I knew it would be intentional. Grandma Rose never did anything without purpose, and as the lawyer's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, I prepared myself for whatever lesson she'd chosen to teach us from beyond the grave. The truth is, I became the granddaughter my family never expected me to be during Grandma Rose's final years, though not in the way they would have preferred. While my cousins sent birthday cards and made obligatory holiday visits, I was the one who showed up every Tuesday evening with takeout from her favorite Chinese restaurant and stayed to sort through the week's medications. It started innocently. Enough. 3 years ago, Grandma Rose had fallen in her garden while trying to plant tulip bulbs for the spring. The fall itself wasn't serious, just a bruised hip and some scraped palms. But it was the catalyst that revealed how much she'd been struggling to maintain her independence. When I arrived at the hospital that evening, having driven straight from school, still wearing my paint-splattered teaching clothes, I found her alone in the emergency room. My mother was at a charity committee meeting she couldn't leave. My uncle was traveling for business, and my cousins were managing their own busy lives with work and young children. "Elena, sweetheart," she'd said when she saw me, her voice soft with relief. "I knew you'd come." That simple statement broke something open in my chest. Of course I'd come. How could I not? But sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while we waited for discharge papers, I realized that my presence wasn't as obvious to everyone else as it was to me. The nursing staff kept asking when other family members would arrive, and I found myself making excuses for their absence, protecting them from judgment, while Grandma Rose squeezed my fingers and told me about the tulips she'd been trying to plant. "They're for you, you know," she'd whispered. "Purple ones. I remember how you used to pick the purple flowers from my garden when you were little. How you'd bring them inside in those tiny fists, like they were the most precious things in the world." The Tuesday dinners became our routine after that. What started as a way to check on her recovery evolved into the highlight of both our weeks. I'd arrive at 5:30, usually exhausted from a day of managing 28 8-year-olds, and she'd have the table set for two with her good china, the kind she'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed special enough. We'd eat lo mein and sweet and sour chicken, while she told me stories I'd never heard before. Stories about her childhood during the Depression, about meeting my grandfather at a USO dance during World War II, about the early years of their marriage when they'd lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery and felt rich beyond measure. She'd ask about my students with genuine curiosity, remembering details about their struggles and celebrating their victories as if they were her own grandchildren. "Tell me about Marcus," she'd say, referring to the third grader who'd been reading below grade level when the year started. "Did he finish that book about dinosaurs you mentioned?" These conversations filled something in me I hadn't realized was empty. At school, I was Miss Elena, the teacher who handled behavioral problems with patience and creativity. At family gatherings, I was the one who didn't quite fit, whose life choices required explanation and defense. But in Grandma Rose's dining room, surrounded by photographs spanning 8 decades of family history, I was simply Elena, the granddaughter who cared enough to show up consistently. As the months passed, our Tuesday routine expanded. I'd arrive earlier to help with small tasks she was finding difficult to manage alone, changing light bulbs that were too high to reach safely, organizing her medications into weekly pill containers, helping her navigate the increasingly complex world of online banking and digital communication. My family saw these activities as evidence of my lack of ambition, time I could have spent pursuing graduate school or dating or building the kind of life they thought I should want, but they didn't understand what those evenings gave me in return. Grandma Rose had a way of listening that made me feel heard, not just in the moment, but retrospectively, as if she was validating experiences I'd carried alone for years. When I told her about the frustration of watching bright kids fall behind because they didn't have support at home, she'd nod with recognition and share stories about her own teaching days. In a one-room schoolhouse outside of town, the children who need us most, she'd say, are often the ones who can't ask for what they need. You're teaching them more than reading and arithmetic, Elena. You're teaching them that someone cares enough to see them. During her final year, as her energy waned and our dinners became quieter affairs, she'd often doze off in her chair while I cleaned up the kitchen. I'd cover her with the Afghan she'd crocheted decades earlier and sit beside her, grading papers or reading, content to be present in her space. Sometimes she'd wake and seem surprised to find me still there, as if my staying was unexpected generosity, rather than simply what you do for people you love. The rest of the family noticed my increased presence in Grandma Rose's life, but their reactions were mixed with something that felt like resentment, disguised as concern. My mother would make comments about me taking advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness, suggesting that my frequent visits were somehow manipulative rather than caring. My uncle would joke about me earning my inheritance in ways that made it clear he thought my time with Grandma Rose was calculated rather than genuine. Their suspicion hurt more than I could admit, partly because it revealed how little they understood either of us. They couldn't fathom that I genuinely enjoyed spending time with an 87-year-old woman, that her stories and wisdom and gentle presence filled something in my life that had been missing. They couldn't imagine that someone might choose connection over ambition, relationship over achievement, love over legacy. In her final months, when hospice nurses began visiting and we all knew time was running short, Grandma Rose became even more intentional about our conversations. She'd talk about regrets she carried, choices she'd made that had shaped the family dynamics I'd grown up navigating, She'd speak carefully about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, rather than who you expected them to be. "Your heart is so big, Elena," she told me one Tuesday evening, her voice weaker than usual, but her eyes still sharp with intelligence. "Don't let anyone convince you that's a weakness. This world needs people who care the way you care." I treasured those words, holding them close during the weeks that followed, when her decline accelerated, and our Tuesday dinners became brief visits to her bedside. Even then, she'd ask about my students, about the books I was reading, about the small details of my life that everyone else dismissed as unremarkable. When she passed on a quiet Thursday morning in early October, I was at school teaching fractions to a room full of third graders. My mother called during my lunch break to deliver the news with characteristic efficiency, her voice controlled and businesslike, as she outlined funeral arrangements and family obligations. But it wasn't until I sat alone in my car after school that day, surrounded by the silence of an empty parking lot, that I allowed myself to fully feel the weight of losing the one person in my family who had truly seen me. Grandma Rose was gone, and with her went the Tuesday evenings that had become the anchor of my week, the conversations that had validated my choices, the unconditional acceptance that had made me feel worthy of love, exactly as I was. The funeral was everything Grandma Rose would have hated. Elaborate flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly salary, a guest list padded with acquaintances who barely knew her but felt obligated to make an appearance, and speeches that painted her as a beloved matriarch while carefully avoiding any mention of the woman who'd spent her final years worrying about lonely children in underfunded classrooms. I sat in the second row, behind the immediate family, but ahead of the distant relatives and family friends, a positioning that felt symbolic of my place in the family hierarchy. My mother had orchestrated the seating arrangements with military precision, ensuring that everyone understood their relative importance in the family structure. The message was clear. I was family, but barely, included out of obligation rather than affection. During the service, I found myself studying the backs of my relatives' heads, wondering what they were thinking as the minister delivered his generic eulogy about a woman he'd met exactly once. Were they remembering the same Grandma Rose I'd known? Or had they constructed their own version of her that better fit their narrative of family dynamics? When my uncle stood to deliver his remembrance, he spoke about her strength and wisdom, her dedication to family values and traditional principles. He painted her as a woman who understood the importance of legacy and bloodline, of maintaining family traditions and preserving generational wealth. It was a beautiful speech about a stranger. The Grandma Rose he described had never existed, at least not in the conversations we'd shared over takeout containers and herbal tea. The woman I'd known had questioned everything, had expressed regret about opportunities she'd missed and relationships she'd failed to nurture. She'd been funny and irreverent, critical of social expectations and family pretensions. She'd rolled her eyes at charity galas and complained about relatives who visited only when they needed something. But this wasn't the time or place to correct the record. This was their grief, their version of closure, their opportunity to remember her in ways that comforted them. I kept my own memories private, the Tuesday evening conversations that had revealed her complexity and humanity, the quiet moments when she'd shared doubts and fears, alongside wisdom and love. The reception after the funeral was held at my mother's house, a sprawling colonial that showcased her impeccable taste and substantial budget. Family members clustered in small groups throughout the living room and kitchen, their conversations a mixture of genuine sorrow and barely concealed curiosity about inheritance matters. I overheard whispered speculation about property values and investment portfolios, discussions that made my stomach turn with their casual calculation. I found myself gravitating toward the kitchen, where I could help serve food and stay busy, rather than navigate awkward conversations about Grandma Rose's final wishes. But even there, I couldn't escape the undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow me wherever I went. My cousin Jennifer cornered me near the coffee station, her voice pitched low with false intimacy. "Elena, I hope you know how much Grandma appreciated everything you did for her these past few years," she said, her words carefully chosen. "It was so sweet of you to spend so much time with her when she was lonely." The implication was clear. My presence in Grandma Rose's life had been charity work, a kindness extended to an elderly woman who needed companionship. The suggestion that our relationship had been one-sided, that I'd been performing acts of service rather than building genuine connection, stung more than I expected. "She wasn't lonely," I replied, perhaps more sharply than necessary. "She had a full life. We enjoyed each other's company." Jennifer's smile was patronizing. "Of course, sweetie. I just meant that it was nice of you to make time for her when the rest of us were so busy with our own families." There it was again, the subtle dismissal of my life as less complicated, less valuable, less demanding than theirs. Because I didn't have children or a husband, my time was apparently limitless and expendable because I chose to spend my evenings with an elderly grandmother rather than networking events or social obligations. I was performing acts of charity rather than investing in meaningful relationships. Similar conversations followed throughout the afternoon. Relatives I barely knew approached me with variations of the same theme, praising my dedication to Grandma Rose in ways that made it clear they viewed my presence in her life as evidence of my lack of other options, rather than a choice I'd made because I valued our connection. My mother was the most direct in her assessment. As guests began to leave and family members gathered in the kitchen to plan the next day's will reading, she pulled me aside with an expression that mixed maternal concern with barely concealed irritation. "Elena, I hope you understand that whatever Mother left you, it's a token of appreciation for your time with her," she said, her voice pitched for privacy, but loud enough that nearby relatives could hear. "Don't read more into it than what it is." Mother was always sentimental about strays. Strays. That's what I'd become in her narrative. Not a granddaughter who'd chosen to prioritize relationship over ambition, but a charity case who'd needed purpose and had found it in caring for an elderly woman. The characterization was so reductive, so dismissive of everything Grandma Rose and I had shared, that I felt my chest tighten with a familiar mixture of hurt and anger. But I'd learned long ago that defending myself to my family was pointless. They'd made up their minds about who I was and what I represented, and no amount of explanation would change their perspective. I was the family member who'd failed to launch, whose life choices required constant interpretation and excuse-making, whose presence at family events was tolerated rather than celebrated. The next morning, as I prepared for the will reading, I tried to manage my expectations. My mother was probably right that whatever Grandma Rose had left me would be symbolic rather than substantial. Perhaps a piece of jewelry or a family photograph, something that acknowledged our relationship without disrupting the family's assumptions. About inheritance and worthiness, I told myself it didn't matter. The real gift Grandma Rose had given me was those 3 years of Tuesday evenings, the conversations that had validated my choices and reminded me that love could exist without conditions or expectations. Whatever she decided about her worldly possessions was secondary to the relationship we'd built. But as I drove to the lawyer's office that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that my family's dismissive attitude toward my role in Grandma Rose's life was about to be challenged in ways none of us expected. The lawyer's office felt smaller, with all of us crammed inside, the air thick with unspoken tensions and barely masked anticipation. Mr. Harrison, Grandma Rose's attorney for over 30 years, sat behind his massive desk, reviewing documents with the measured calm of someone who'd presided over countless family dramas. His grey suit and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of judicial authority that seemed to make everyone sit a little straighter in their chairs. My mother had arrived early, as she did for everything important, and had somehow managed to orchestrate the seating arrangements even in someone else's office. She'd claimed the chair directly facing Mr. Harrison, positioning herself as the family spokesperson and primary beneficiary. My Uncle David sat to her right, his posture rigid with the kind of nervous energy that comes from trying to appear calm while internally calculating numbers. His wife Margaret flanked his other side, her designer handbag clutched in her laps like a shield against disappointment. My cousins had arranged themselves around the table with varying degrees of interest and anxiety. Jennifer kept checking her phone, presumably managing some crisis at her marketing firm that couldn't wait for our family business to conclude. Michael drummed his fingers against the table edge, his eyes fixed on the stack of legal documents that would soon reveal how his grandmother had chosen to distribute her considerable wealth. And then there was me, once again relegated to the folding chair they'd brought in from another room, positioned so far from the main table that I had to lean forward to hear clearly. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I was an observer rather than a participant, present by necessity rather than right, tolerated rather than welcomed. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began with the usual legal preliminaries, reading dates and declarations in the formal language that transforms personal intentions into binding legal documents. The will had been updated recently, he noted, just 6 months before Grandma Rose's death, a fact that caused several family members to exchange meaningful glances. Rose specifically requested that all beneficiaries be present for this reading. Mr. Harrison continued, his eyes scanning the room. She wanted her final wishes to be understood in the context of family, not delivered piecemeal, through individual conversations. My mother shifted in her chair, her discomfort obvious. Of course, Mother always had a flair for the dramatic. I'm sure she's left us all lovely keepsakes to remember her by. The condescension in her voice made my stomach clench. Even now, even after death, she couldn't resist diminishing Grandma Rose's autonomy and intelligence. The woman who'd built a successful business alongside her husband, who'd managed investments and property and family finances for decades, was being reduced to a sentimental old lady who made decisions based on emotion rather than judgment. Mr. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been disapproval. He'd known Grandma Rose for 3 decades, had watched her navigate widowhood and aging with grace and determination. He knew better than anyone that her decisions were always intentional. Before we begin with the specific bequests, he said, pulling out a sealed envelope, Rose asked me to read a statement she prepared specifically for this occasion. The room fell silent. My mother's carefully composed expression faltered slightly, and I saw her exchange a worried glance with my uncle. Whatever they'd expected from this meeting, a personal statement from beyond the grave wasn't part of their script. Mr. Harrison opened the envelope with careful precision and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in Grandma Rose's familiar handwriting. Even from my distant chair, I could recognize the flowing script that had filled birthday cards and thank you notes throughout my childhood. "To my family," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reading another person's words with respect and attention. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you're gathered to learn how I've chosen to distribute the material possessions I've accumulated over 8 decades of living." My mother's jaw tightened. She'd always hated it when Grandma Rose spoke directly about death, preferring euphemisms and gentle deflections to honest acknowledgement of mortality. "I want you to know that every decision I've made regarding my estate has been deliberate and carefully considered. I've had months to think about these choices, to weigh the needs and contributions of each family member, and to consider what kind of legacy I want to leave behind." The formal language was vintage Grandma Rose, clear and uncompromising. I could almost hear her voice in the words, the same tone she'd used when explaining difficult concepts to me as a child, or setting boundaries with family members who pushed too hard. I've lived long enough to see how people reveal themselves in moments of crisis and opportunity. I've watched how each of you responds to need, how you prioritize your time and energy, how you define family obligation and personal responsibility. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My cousins stopped their fidgeting, and my uncle's face had gone pale. Whatever they'd expected from this reading, it wasn't a character assessment delivered from beyond the grave. Mr. Harrison paused, glancing around the room to ensure he had everyone's attention. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. "I want to be clear that my decisions are not punishments or rewards. They are acknowledgements of the relationships we built together and the values each of you has demonstrated through your actions, rather than your words." My mother's composure was beginning to crack. She'd spent decades managing Grandma Rose's image and legacy, controlling the narrative of their relationship and family dynamics. The idea that her mother had been making independent assessments, drawing her own conclusions about family members based on observed behavior, rather than accepted hierarchy, was clearly threatening. Some of you will be surprised by my choices. Some of you will feel that I've made mistakes or failed to recognize your contributions to the family. I ask that you remember that these decisions come from a place of love and careful observation, not caprice or manipulation. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Around the table, faces were carefully composed masks, hiding whatever emotions were churning beneath the surface. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I hope that, in time, you'll understand that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or property deeds, but in the relationships we build and the love we share freely without expectation of return. The people who will benefit most from my estate are those who understood this during my lifetime. Mr. Harrison folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. The silence that followed was deafening, charged with tension and unspoken accusations. I could feel my family members processing what they'd just heard, recalculating their expectations, and examining their own behavior through Grandma Rose's posthumous lens. My mother was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled, but edged with something that might have been panic. "Well, that was certainly typical of Mother. Always did enjoy keeping us guessing." But her attempt at levity fell flat. Everyone in the room understood that we'd just heard more than sentimental words from a deceased matriarch. We'd heard the preamble to a reckoning, a settling of accounts that had been years in the making. Mr. Harrison arranged his papers with deliberate precision, and I realized We were about to learn exactly what Grandma Rose's careful observations had led
Mr.
her
Harrison
to
began with the
conclude
smaller
about each of
bequests.
us, his voice steady and professional as he worked through a list that seemed designed to build tension rather than relieve it. My cousin Jennifer received Grandma Rose's pearl necklace and a modest sum for her daughter's college fund. Michael inherited her collection of first edition books and enough money to pay off his student loans. Each bequest was thoughtful and specific, accompanied by brief explanations that revealed how closely Grandma Rose had been paying attention to their lives. My Uncle David received her late husband's watch and tools, along with a sum that would allow him to expand his contracting business. Margaret inherited Grandma Rose's china set and jewelry collection, items that had been in the family for generations. The amounts were generous, but not life-changing. The kinds of gifts that acknowledged relationship while maintaining family harmony. My mother received the largest individual bequest so far, $50,000, and several pieces of valuable artwork that had hung in Grandma Rose's living room for decades. It was a substantial inheritance, the kind of sum that reflected both love and respect. My mother's visible relief was palpable as she relaxed into her chair, vindicated in her assumption that she would be the primary beneficiary. And now, Mr. Harrison said, his tone shifting slightly, we come to the matter of the house and remaining assets. The house, Grandma Rose's beautiful Victorian home on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and established gardens, its hardwood floors and bay windows that caught the afternoon light perfectly. The house where I'd spent countless Tuesday evenings, where we'd shared meals and conversations and quiet moments of connection. The house that held 80 years of family history and probably $1 million in current market value. Elena Martinez, Mr. Harrison continued, and suddenly everyone in the room was looking at me. Rose has left you the house at 247 Maple Street, along with all its contents, as well as the remainder of her estate, including investment accounts, savings, and property holdings. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, saw my uncle's face go white with shock. My cousins turned to stare at me, with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility, as if I'd somehow orchestrated this outcome through manipulation or deceit. But I was as stunned as anyone. The folding chair beneath me suddenly felt insubstantial, as if it might collapse under the weight of what I'd just heard. The house, the remainder of the estate, the implications were staggering, not just financially, but emotionally, socially, familially. That's impossible, my mother said, her voice sharp with disbelief. There must be some mistake. Elena isn't. Even, she stopped herself, but we all knew how that sentence was going to end. Elena isn't even a real part of this family. Elena doesn't deserve this. Elena hasn't earned the right to inherit what should belong to people with more legitimate claims. Mr. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried a subtle firmness that suggested he'd anticipated this reaction. There's no mistake. Patricia, the will is quite clear and specific. Elena inherits the house, its contents, and all remaining assets not previously designated. My uncle found his voice next, his words carefully controlled, but edged with something that sounded like rage. How much are we talking about? The remaining assets. Approximately $1.2 million. Mr. Harrison replied matter-of-factly. Plus, the house, which was recently appraised at $890,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $2 million. Nearly $2 million left to the family member they'd always treated as an afterthought. The one who'd been relegated to folding chairs and dismissive comments about her life choices, my mother's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. Elena barely has a relationship with Mother. She just started showing up these past few years when she realized." Again she stopped herself, but the implication was clear. When she realized there might be something to gain. "Actually," Mr. Harrison said quietly, pulling out another document. Rose was quite specific about her reasoning. She asked me to include this additional statement to be read if her primary bequests were questioned. My heart was pounding so hard. I could hear it in my ears. Around the table, my family members looked like they were watching a car accident, in slow motion, unable to look away from the destruction, but horrified by what they were seeing. Mr. Harrison began to read. "Eleanor has been the only family member who consistently showed interest in my life, rather than my assets. For 3 years, she has visited every week, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. She has listened to my stories, shared her own challenges and victories, and treated me as a person worthy of time and attention, rather than a burden, to be managed." My mother's face was flushed with humiliation and anger. "That's not fair. We all cared about Mother. We all had busy lives, responsibilities. She has never asked me for money or favors." Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice cutting through my mother's protests. "She has never made me feel like an obligation or treated my aging as an inconvenience. When I fell in my garden, Elena was the first to arrive at the hospital and the last to leave. When I needed help with medications or household tasks, she offered assistance without making me feel helpless or burdensome." The accuracy of these observations was devastating. Every criticism was subtle but precise, highlighting the difference between Eleanor's approach to family relationship and everyone else's. Grandma Rose had been watching, evaluating, drawing conclusions about what kind of love and attention she was receiving from each family member. Elena chose to spend her free time with me, not because she had nothing better to do, but because she valued our relationship. She made me feel seen and heard and appreciated as a person, not just as a source of potential inheritance. She is the only family member who never made me feel like my death would be primarily an opportunity for financial gain. The silence that followed was deafening. My family members sat frozen in their chairs, processing not just the financial implications of Grandma Rose's decision, but the emotional indictment it represented. They'd all been measured and found wanting, their motivations and priorities examined and judged lacking. Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Eleanor, you must have known. You must have had some idea this was coming." The accusation hung between us like a challenge. They needed to believe that I'd manipulated this situation, that I'd calculated my way into Grandma Rose's good graces with the specific goal of financial gain. The alternative, that I'd simply loved my grandmother and received love in return, was apparently too threatening to their worldview. "I had no idea," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "I never expected anything like this." "Of course you didn't," my mother said, but her tone suggested she believed exactly the opposite. "You just happened to become the devoted granddaughter right around the time Mother started showing signs of aging and vulnerability." The injustice of that characterization took my breath away. 3 years of Tuesday dinners, hundreds of hours of conversation and companionship, genuine love and care and connection, all reduced to calculated manipulation in service of financial gain. But before I could defend myself, Mr. Harrison spoke again. Rose anticipated that her decision might be questioned. which is why she included one more element to today's reading. He pulled out a sealed envelope, this one addressed in Grandma Rose's handwriting. For Elena, to be opened after the will, is read. He handed it to me across the vast distance between my folding chair and his desk. My hands were shaking as I accepted it, aware that every eye in the room was fixed on my face, waiting to see how I would react to whatever final message my grandmother had left for me. The envelope was heavier than expected, as if it contained more than just a letter. As I broke the seal, I realized that whatever was inside would either vindicate Grandma Rose's decision or provide ammunition for my family's accusations of manipulation. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages inside the envelope, recognizing immediately the careful script that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists throughout my childhood. But this wasn't a brief note or casual message. This was several pages of Grandma Rose's thoughts, written with the deliberate precision of someone who knew these might be among her final words to me. My dearest Elena, I read silently, aware that every person in the room was watching my face for clues about the letter's contents. The weight of their scrutiny made it difficult to focus on the words, but Grandma Rose's voice came through clearly. In the opening lines, "If you're reading this, it means my final wishes have been revealed, and I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders. I also imagine that other family members up from the letter are questioning my mother's my decision, boring into perhaps me, suggesting with an intensity that somehow manipulated an elderly she was waiting for me to share the contents that benefit to provide evidence that would either justify or condemn Grandma Rose's decision. But something in the letter's tone suggested this was meant to be private. At least initially, Mr. Harrison, I said quietly, would it be possible for me to read this privately? I think my grandmother intended this to be personal. My mother's objection was immediate and sharp. Elena, if that letter contains information relevant to Mother's estate decisions, we have a right to know what it says. We're all family here. Mr. Harrison looked between us with the measured calm of someone who'd navigated countless family disputes. The letter is addressed specifically to Elena and was not designated as part of the official will reading. She has the right to privacy regarding its contents, unless she chooses to share it, my uncle added, his tone carrying a weight of expectation that felt like coercion. I looked down at the pages in my hands, at the familiar handwriting that had always meant love and acceptance, and made a decision that surprised even me. I'll read some of it aloud, I said. The parts that might help explain my grandmother's reasoning. It wasn't capitulation to their demands, so much as recognition that Grandma Rose's wisdom deserved to be heard, that her observations about family dynamics might teach us all something important about ourselves. I cleared my throat and began to read. Elena, I want you to understand that my decision to leave you the house and the majority of my estate was not made lightly or sentimentally. It was the result of careful observation over many years, but particularly during these final 3 years when my mortality became undeniable. The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of pages. As I turned to the next section, I have watched how each family member responds to need, both spoken and unspoken. I have seen who asks about my well-being versus who asks about my investments. I have noticed who remembers my stories and who changes the subject when I share memories that don't involve money or inheritance. My cousin Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. These weren't abstract observations, but specific indictments of behavior that everyone in the room could recognize. When I fell in my garden 3 years ago, you were the only family member who asked about my emotional state rather than my physical injuries. While others discussed the practical implications of my aging, you wanted to know if I was frightened, if I felt vulnerable, if I needed companionship during my recovery. I remembered that evening at the hospital, how small and fragile she'd seemed in the emergency room bed, how relieved she'd been when I'd arrived, and simply held her hand without immediately launching into discussions about safety modifications or care facilities. Your Tuesday visits became the highlight of my week, not because I was lonely or isolated, but because you treated our time together as valuable in itself. You never checked your phone during our conversations. You never seemed eager to leave or impatient with my stories. You made me feel like spending time with me was something you chose, rather than something you endured. The accuracy of this observation was devastating in its simplicity. I could see my family members processing the implication, recognizing their own behavior in the contrast Grandma Rose was drawing. I watched you help with medications and household tasks without making me feel helpless or burdensome. You found ways to assist that preserved my dignity and independence. When other family members suggested that I needed more supervision or should consider selling the house, you asked what would make me feel safest and most comfortable. My mother's face was flushed with what looked like shame, mixed with anger. I knew she was remembering conversations about assisted living facilities and home health aides, discussions conducted around Grandma Rose rather than with her, decisions debated as if she were already incapacitated rather than simply aging. But more than anything, Elena, you saw me as a complete person, rather than a collection of problems to be solved or assets to be managed. You were interested in my thoughts about politics and books and current events. You valued my opinions and experiences. You made me feel like my mind and personality were still worthy of attention and respect. I had to pause in my reading because my voice was beginning to shake. These weren't just kind words from a grateful grandmother. They were a precise description of what I'd experienced during those Tuesday evenings. The sense that I was connecting with someone who understood that relationships could exist without agenda or expectation. I am leaving you my house because it was in that house that we built our relationship. It is where you learned my stories and where I came to understand your heart. I want you to have a foundation for the life you're building, the kind of security that will allow you to continue choosing connection over calculation, relationship over advancement. The financial implications of the inheritance were significant, but this framing transformed them into something deeper. This wasn't just money. It was recognition of values, validation of choices, investment in a way of being in the world that Grandma Rose wanted to encourage and support. The money I'm leaving you represents decades of careful saving and investment. I want you to use it to build the kind of life that reflects your priorities rather than other people's expectations. Whether that means continuing to teach, pursuing additional education, traveling, or simply having the security to make choices based on passion rather than financial necessity. I glanced up to see my family members processing this part of the letter, with expressions ranging from resignation to resentment. The idea that I might use this inheritance to continue living a life they considered underachieving was clearly galling to them. I know that some family members will question my decision. They may suggest that you manipulated me or took advantage of my age and vulnerability. I want you to know that nothing could be further from the truth. You gave me exactly what I needed during my final years: genuine companionship, patient attention, and unconditional acceptance. The letter continued with specific memories and observations that painted a picture of our relationship that was both accurate and deeply moving. Grandma Rose had been paying attention to details I hadn't even realized were significant, storing up evidence of care and connection that she'd apparently intended to use as justification for her final decisions. Elena, I hope you'll understand that this inheritance comes with no obligations except to yourself. You don't owe anyone explanations for my choices or apologies for accepting what I've freely given. You have earned this through years of genuine love and attention, through the simple act of seeing an elderly woman as worthy of your time and care. As I finished reading the portions I'd chosen to share, the room remained silent. Whatever objections my family members might have had about Grandma Rose's mental state or my influence over her decisions, this letter made it clear that her choices were deliberate, well-reasoned, and based on careful observation of our behavior. Over many years, the letter had explained everything and changed nothing. I was still the family member who'd been relegated to folding chairs and dismissive comments. The only difference was that now I had nearly $2 million and a house to call my own. The aftermath of Mr. Harrison's reading was swift and brutal. My mother was the first to stand, gathering her purse with sharp, jerky movements that spoke to barely controlled fury. Her face was pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks, and when she looked at me, her expression held a mixture of betrayal and disgust that made my stomach clench. "This is unconscionable," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Eleanor, I hope you're proud of yourself. You've managed to convince a vulnerable elderly woman to disinherit her own children in favor of someone who barely qualifies as family." The words hit like physical blows. Barely qualifies as family. Even now, even after everything Grandma Rose had written about our relationship, my mother couldn't acknowledge that I might have genuinely earned this inheritance through love and care, rather than manipulation and deceit. My Uncle David was standing now too, his contractor's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There has to be a way to contest this," he said, directing his words to Mr. Harrison rather than to me. Mother wasn't thinking clearly these past few years. Anyone could see that her judgment was compromised. Mr. Harrison's response was measured, but firm. Rose underwent a thorough psychological evaluation just 6 months ago when she updated her will. She was found to be completely competent and of sound mind. The will is legally binding and was executed according to all state requirements. "A psychological evaluation you probably recommended," Jennifer added, her voice dripping with suspicion. How convenient that Elena's increased presence in Grandma's life coincided with these estate planning changes. I found myself caught between the impulse to defend myself and the growing realization that nothing I said would matter. They'd already constructed their narrative about what had happened, and no amount of explanation would change their minds. In their version of events, I was the calculating granddaughter who preyed on an elderly woman's loneliness, my voice coming out stronger than I'd financial expected. Gain. I never asked for any of this. I never even thought about inheritance. When I was spending time with Grandma Rose, I was there because I loved her, because I enjoyed her company, because she made me feel valued and understood. "Oh, please," Margaret said, speaking for the first time since the reading began. "You expect us to believe that you spent 3 years playing the devoted granddaughter out of pure altruism, that you never once considered what might be in it for you. The suggestion that love and care could only be motivated by potential gain revealed more about their worldview than mine, but trying to explain that felt hopeless, like attempting to describe color to someone who'd only ever seen in black and white." Michael, who'd been silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Elena, you have to admit this looks suspicious from the outside. You were never particularly close to Grandma before her health started declining. Then, suddenly you're there every week, helping with everything, Becoming her confidant. I became close to her because I made the effort, I replied, because I showed up consistently and treated her with respect and genuine interest. That's how relationships work. That's how manipulation works too, my mother said coldly. You identified a vulnerable target and systematically isolated her from her real family, while positioning yourself as indispensable. The cruelty of this characterization took my breath away. 3 years of genuine connection, hundreds of hours of conversation and companionship, countless moments of shared laughter and understanding, all reduced to a calculated scheme for financial gain. But what hurt most was the realization that this was probably what they'd all been thinking during those Tuesday dinners I'd treasured, while I'd been building what I thought was a meaningful relationship with my grandmother. They'd been watching and judging, interpreting my presence as evidence of ulterior motives rather than genuine care. I'm going to speak with my attorney, my uncle announced, as if this settled the matter. There are ways to challenge wills when undue influence can be demonstrated. This inheritance is going to be tied up in legal proceedings for years. The threat hung in the air like a sword, designed to make me understand that accepting Grandma Rose's gift would come with consequences beyond family disapproval. They were prepared to drag this through the courts, to publicly accuse me of elder abuse and manipulation, to destroy what remained of our family relationships. In pursuit of what they saw as justice, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. I should mention that Rose anticipated the possibility of legal challenges to her will. She included a provision stating that any beneficiary who contests the will forfeits their inheritance entirely, with their portion being donated to charity. This information landed like a bomb in the already tense room. My family members exchanged glances that conveyed rapid calculations about the cost of challenging versus accepting what they'd been given. Jennifer was the first to process the implications. So, if we contest Elena's inheritance, we lose our own bequests. That's correct, Mr. Harrison confirmed. Rose was quite specific about wanting to discourage legal battles over her final wishes. Even in death, Grandma Rose was still teaching lessons about consequences and priorities. She'd structured her will to force family members to choose between accepting her decisions gracefully or risking everything in pursuit of what they felt they deserved. One by one, my family members began to leave the conference room, their departures marked by slammed doors and muttered threats about family lawyers and psychological evaluations. My mother was the last to go, pausing at the door to deliver a final condemnation. Elena, you've destroyed this family for money. I hope it was worth it, because you're not welcome in our lives anymore. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my daughter. The words echoed in the suddenly empty room, long after she'd gone. No longer my daughter. The relationship that had been strained and difficult for 37 years was now severed completely. Casualty of an inheritance I'd never sought and decisions I'd never made. I sat alone in that conference room for several minutes after everyone had left, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd become wealthy and orphaned, vindicated and vilified, liberated and completely alone. Mr. Harrison was packing up his papers with the efficient movements of someone who'd witnessed countless family disasters. When he noticed I hadn't moved, he looked up with something that might have been sympathy. Elena, I worked with your grandmother for 30 years, he said quietly. She was one of the most thoughtful and deliberate people I've ever known. Her decisions about you weren't made lightly or emotionally. She saw something in you that she valued, and she wanted to make sure you had the resources to build the life you deserve. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The validation was comforting, but it couldn't erase the devastation of losing my entire family in service of gaining financial security I'd never asked for. As I finally stood to leave, I realized that Grandma Rose's final gift had come with a price I was only beginning to understand. She'd given me wealth and independence, but she'd also given me the truth about my family's love, that it had always been conditional, transactional, dependent on my willingness to remain small and grateful and undemanding. Now I had to figure out what to do with both the money and the truth. 3 days after the will reading, I stood on the front porch of 247 Maple Street with a set of keys that felt impossibly heavy in my hand. The house looked exactly the same as it had during my last Tuesday visit 6 weeks earlier, but everything about my relationship to it had changed. This was no longer Grandma Rose's house, where I was a welcome guest. This was my house, my responsibility, my inheritance and burden, all wrapped into one. The key turned easily in the familiar lock, and I stepped into the foyer that had welcomed me for 3 years of weekly dinners. The hardwood floors still gleamed with the careful polish Grandma Rose had maintained even in her final months, and the afternoon light still filtered through the stained glass panels beside the door, casting familiar patterns of blue and amber across the walls. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a grandmother resting in her chair while I cleaned up the kitchen. It was the absolute stillness of a house that no longer held life, no longer echoed with conversation and laughter, and the small sounds of daily living. I walked slowly through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on floors that had once carried the weight of 8 decades of family life. In the living room, Grandma Rose's reading chair still held the impression of her body, the cushions molded to accommodate the hours she'd spent there with books and crossword puzzles and cups of tea. The side table still held her reading glasses and the mystery novel she'd been working through during her final week. The kitchen retained the faint scent of the herbal tea she'd favored in her last months, chamomile and honey that had supposedly helped with sleeping, but really just provided comfort during restless nights. The good china we'd used for our Tuesday dinners was still arranged in the cabinet, waiting for the next special occasion that would never come. I found myself gravitating toward the dining room, where we'd shared so many conversations over takeout, containers, and carefully brewed tea. The table was set for one, as if she'd been expecting company that never arrived. A single placemat, a single cup and saucer, a single cloth napkin, folded with the precision of someone who'd maintained standards, even when no one was watching. This was where she'd told me about her childhood during the Depression, about rationing, sugar, and wearing clothes, until they fell apart and finding joy in small luxuries like fresh fruit or a new book from the library. This was where she'd shared stories about meeting my grandfather at that USO dance, about their courtship conducted through letters during his deployment overseas, about the early years of their marriage when they'd been so poor and so happy. This was where she'd listened to my stories about challenging students and difficult parents and the small victories that made teaching worthwhile, where she'd validated my choice to prioritize relationships over advancement, compassion over calculation, where she'd made me feel seen and valued and understood in ways my biological family never had. Now the dining room felt like a shrine to conversations that could never be repeated, wisdom that had been shared and would have to be remembered rather than renewed. I sat in my usual chair and tried to summon the comfort those Tuesday evenings had provided, but all I felt was the crushing weight of absence. Upstairs, Grandma Rose's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it. The bed was made with hospital corners that could have passed military inspection, the dresser top arranged with photographs, spanning 8 decades of birthdays and anniversaries and graduations. There were pictures of my grandfather in his army uniform, of my mother and uncle as children, of grandchildren at various stages of growth and achievement. I found myself studying these photographs with new eyes, looking for evidence of the family dynamics Grandma Rose had observed and documented in her final letter. Here was my mother at my age, her expression already carrying the sharp focus that would later calcify into rigid control. Here was my uncle as a teenager, his smile easy and uncomplicated, before life taught him to measure relationships in terms of utility and return on investment. And scattered throughout the collection were photographs of me, from childhood snapshots to recent pictures Grandma Rose had somehow acquired, without my knowledge. Me at my college graduation, looking uncertain but hopeful. Me at a school function, surrounded by students whose faces glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from feeling truly seen and cared for. Me at last year's family Christmas gathering, sitting slightly apart from the main group, but smiling genuinely at something Grandma Rose had said. Looking at these images, I began to understand something about my grandmother's perspective that I'd missed during our conversations. She'd been watching me navigate family gatherings for years, observing how I tried to find my place among people who'd never quite known what to do with me. She'd seen my attempts to contribute to conversations that moved past me, my efforts to connect with relatives who viewed my presence as obligation rather than gift. In her bedroom closet, I found clothes that still carried the faint scent of her perfume, a floral fragrance that had seemed old-fashioned to my teenage self, but now felt like distilled elegance. There were dresses from decades past that she'd kept for sentimental reasons, formal gowns from charity events and anniversary celebrations, everyday clothes that showed the careful mending and alterations of someone who'd lived through times when nothing was disposable. But it was in her desk drawer that I found the most revealing artifacts of our relationship. There, organized with the same precision she'd applied to everything else in her life, was a collection of items I'd never known she'd saved. Thank you notes from my students' parents that I'd shared with her during our dinners, newspaper clippings about school events where I'd been mentioned, programs from concerts, and plays where my class had performed. She'd been documenting my life in ways I'd never realized, collecting evidence of the impact I was making in the world. Even when my own family dismissed my choices as unambitious, each saved item was a validation of my worth, proof that someone had been paying attention to my contributions and finding them valuable. At the bottom of the drawer was a manila envelope with my name written in her careful script. Inside, I found copies of every thank you note she'd ever written to me, drafts that revealed how carefully she'd chosen her words to express gratitude without making me feel like a charity case. There were also notes she'd apparently written, but never sent, observations about my character, and choices that she'd wanted to preserve, even if she couldn't find the right moment to share them. Eleanor has a gift for seeing people as they truly are, rather than as she wants them to be, read one note dated just 6 months earlier. She accepts family members exactly as they are, while still hoping they might grow into something better. This combination of realism and optimism is rare and precious. As the afternoon light faded into evening, I found myself sitting in Grandma Rose's living room, surrounded by the material evidence of a life fully lived. The house felt less empty now, not because her presence had returned, but because I was beginning to understand the intentionality behind her final gift. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was an investment in the person she'd watched me become and the life she'd wanted me to build. The house wasn't just shelter. It was foundation, The money wasn't just financial security. It was freedom to continue choosing connection over calculation, relationship over advancement, love over legacy. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something other than overwhelming confusion about what Grandma Rose had done. I felt grateful. 6 months after the will reading, I made a decision that would have shocked my family if they'd still been speaking to me. I resigned from my teaching position and used part of my inheritance to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting teachers in underfunded schools. It wasn't the choice anyone expected me to make with sudden wealth, but it was the choice that honored both Grandma Rose's values and my own. The foundation office occupied the converted sunroom of my inherited house, the space where Grandma Rose had once tended seedlings for her garden. Now it was filled with grant applications and program proposals, correspondence with teachers who were using their own money to buy classroom supplies, and staying late to tutor students whose parents worked multiple jobs. My family's prediction about legal challenges had proven accurate, though not in the way they'd intended. My Uncle David had indeed consulted with attorneys about contesting the will, but the strength of Grandma Rose's psychological evaluation and the forfeiture clause she'd included had made their case untenable. Instead of pursuing litigation, they'd chosen a different form of retaliation: complete social exile. I'd been disinvited from family gatherings, excluded from birthday celebrations and holiday traditions I'd participated in for 37 years. My cousins had blocked me on social media, and my mother had returned every Christmas and birthday gift I'd sent since the inheritance. Each package marked "Return to Sender" in her distinctive handwriting. The isolation was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Despite the complicated dynamics of our relationships, these people had been the constant backdrop of my life for nearly 4 decades. Their absence left gaps in my social calendar and holes in my sense of identity that I was still learning to navigate. But the silence also brought unexpected clarity. Without the constant pressure to justify my choices to people who'd never understood them, I was free to explore possibilities I'd never considered. The foundation work introduced me to educators from around the country who shared my values and priorities. I found myself building relationships based on common purpose, rather than shared DNA, connections that felt more authentic and sustaining than many of the family ties I'd lost. One of my first grants went to Marcus Washington, a 5th grade teacher in Detroit who'd been using his own paycheck to provide weekend food packages for students who qualified for free school meals. His thank you letter included photographs of children whose faces glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing someone cares about their well-being. "You've given me the resources to focus on teaching instead of fundraising," he wrote. "But more than that, you've reminded me that there are people in the world who understand that education is about more than test scores and budget metrics." Another grant supported Maria Santos, a bilingual educator in Texas, who developed innovative programs for helping immigrant children maintain connections to their cultural heritage while mastering English. Her work was transforming, not just individual students, but entire communities, building bridges between cultures in ways that created belonging rather than assimilation. These teachers were doing exactly what I'd spent years trying to do in my own classroom, seeing students as complete human beings rather than data points, understanding that learning happens best in environments where children feel valued and supported. The foundation allowed me to amplify their impact in ways that felt more meaningful than any salary or benefit package I'd ever received. But the most unexpected gift of my new life was the community I found among other people who'd chosen purpose over convention. Through the foundation work, I met social workers and nonprofit directors, community organizers, and volunteer coordinators, people who'd built careers around service rather than advancement. Many of them had their own stories of family disapproval and social pressure to pursue more practical paths. They understood the weight of choosing values over validation, the loneliness that could come from prioritizing meaning over money. In their company, I felt less like an outlier and more like part of a community of people who'd found ways to align their work with their hearts. Sarah Chen, the director of a literacy program in San Francisco, became a particularly close friend and colleague. During one of our monthly video calls to discuss collaborative programs, she shared her own story of family exile. "My parents wanted me to become a doctor, like my brother," she said, her expression mixing sadness with acceptance. "When I chose social work instead, they acted like I'd deliberately chosen to fail. It took me years to understand that their disappointment said more about their fears than my choices." These conversations helped me process the grief I felt about losing my family relationships. The pain was real and significant, but it was also clarifying. I was mourning not just the people I'd lost, but the illusion that their approval had ever been based on unconditional love rather than conditional performance.